South Korean President Myung will be meeting Donald Trump in the coming hours in their first face-to-face summit in Washington, D.C. It is a pivotal moment for South Korea's new leader as the decades-old alliance strains under Washington's increasing focus on China, Seoul's biggest trading partner. Mr. Lee and Mr. Trump are expected to cement fresh trade gains from a July deal that slashed American tariffs on Korean goods to 15%. Security issues likely to be top of the agenda as well. CNA's Lim Yun Suk explains the strategic flexibility that Washington wants from Seoul with regard to South Korea's relations with China.
Well, very difficult tasks for President Lee Jae-myung when he meets President Trump, because, President Lee Jae-myung faces this delicate balancing act on this strategic flexibility, because now the U.S. has officially said recently that the U.S. troops based here will be remaining focused on the Korean Peninsula. It will also support the broader objectives of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, which means that it can be used for missions in places like the South China Sea or even Taiwan. Now, here in South Korea, most of the South Korean people see the U.S. forces as being the protection against Pyongyang and not a global strike force. So if President Lee Jae-myung is seen as agreeing to U.S. operations, not just here on the Korean Peninsula, then, he could face this risk, a political backlash back here in South Korea. But then, it also remains to be seen if he is willing to join hands with the United States and in a way, aggravate the situation with China, because China is South Korea's largest trading partner. And South Korea remembers how China punished the country when the U.S. defense missile shield, so-called THAAD, was deployed here on the Korean Peninsula in 2017. Now, South Korea's companies doing businesses in China, and the country, too, was very badly hit by China then. And so there are worries that if South Korea takes sides, it could trigger this repeat of that retaliation by China. And then, there's the money issue, like you said. When experts here are saying that it is true that South Korea realizes that it will have to increase its defense spending, but realistically, how much room does South Korea have? And he could talk about alliances, regional stability, but, many here are saying that he is unlikely to agree to U.S. forces doing missions beyond the Korean Peninsula. So, he'll have to play his cards right, reassure Washington about the strong alliance, but also not provide Beijing, let Beijing take this opportunity to take some kind of retaliation against South Korea.
Well, Simon Marks joins us for the perspective from Washington, D.C. Simon, thanks for joining us. Now, diplomatically, the U.S. might want to elicit more commitment from Seoul to counter China economically and militarily, I imagine.
Yeah, well, that's clearly going to be a difficult element, Jill, of the leaders' conversations here today. President Lee indicated on his way to Washington that he views the idea of refocusing South Korea's military alliance with the United States away from deterring North Korea and towards the need to countering China as a very challenging element of the conversation that lies ahead. It's not an issue we can easily agree with, he told reporters traveling with him. And that's because in South Korea, there is no complete agreement that China is the biggest threat the country faces, given its proximity to North Korea and the complexities that exist along the border between North and South. But the Trump administration is clear, not just with South Korea, but across the board, that it really wants to place an intensity of focus now on trying to constrain China and its expansionist aspirations in the region. And with 28,500 US troops stationed in South Korea, the US clearly thinks it has physical muscle and pressure points to exercise in today's conversation. So while it's clear that President Lee is absolutely going to argue for his right to operate autonomously and independent of the world's major powers, President Trump is going into this conversation thinking that he's got the capacity to try and cajole his guest into understanding that the idea of relying on the US for security but China for markets and trade is going to be a very complicated tightrope act that President Lee may seek to pull off.
And a matter of playing cards right, as our correspondent mentioned earlier. But South Korea has also pledged to boost American shipbuilding industry to the tune of $150 billion US. Could that potentially be a strategic and symbolic win for both sides if it comes to fruition?
Well, it's definitely going to capture President Trump's attention. Trade, as you know, is his favoured tool of diplomacy in many ways, and he judges the quality of his international interlocutors in large measure based on their willingness not only to strike commitments but also to follow through on them. And if they don't, he can, of course, always unleash additional tariffs to focus the mind, whether it's in Seoul or anywhere else. So he is going to be looking for commitment, and President Lee is coming here saying that he can help make American shipbuilding great again. He's bringing that $150 billion package to build new U.S. shipyards, train personnel, maintain the American Navy's fleet. And to underscore all of that, President Lee, possibly with President Trump, we don't know yet, will visit a shipyard in Philadelphia on Tuesday that the South Koreans have already acquired. So it's that kind of transactional stuff that generally appeals to President Trump. And while the two men do not share ideological or philosophical outlooks generally on trade, they may be able to find some common cause.
All right, keeping an eye on the upcoming talk, Simon Marks in Washington, D.C. Thank you.